Hello and welcome to the New View here with Gavin, James and Colin. We're back today in O'Shea's Hotel after last week's episode with David Cullinan in his constituency office in Waterford. We're very thankful to O'Shea's Hotel for providing us with recording space once again. So joining us on the programme today is Brían Ó'Fanín. Brían, we really appreciate you appearing on the programme.
Thank you very much.
We will be exploring the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and, for many of our listeners, it may be their first time hearing about this. The 18 to 25-year-old category is our main demographic. And, for the best of us, and no matter what age we are, this can be quite a difficult topic to understand. And we're hoping that you'll be able to humanise this topic a little bit for us today and present the Palestinian viewpoint on this issue. So thank you so much for appearing.
You're very welcome.
You've been to Palestine. You're going to share with us your story. We're going to talk a little bit about contemporary issues as well, how you felt out there and what you saw. And it's a brilliant story, and we're so glad that you can share it with us. So James, I'll let you lead with the first question there.
Yeah, so Brían, just to get us started off, why would someone from Waterford get involved in something that's happening thousands of miles away?
That's a good question. I suppose going back to my early childhood, my parents, we were always talking about things as regards civil rights, and when you watch films like when you're younger about Mississippi burning and Cry Freedom about South African apartheid, you become very kind of interested in that battle for human rights and dignity, in particular from an Irish perspective. When your family was involved in the struggle for freedom in Ireland itself, you become, stories of the past have kind of relevance in what you're reading from these other places. So I would have been writing letters and very interested in the apartheid during the 90s, the 80s and the 90s as a very young lad. And then also Timor and different kind of injustices like that. I would have said when I was very young, I didn't really understand what was happening over there. Right up until, I'd say, the turn of the century, I would have equated the Israelis as being the underdog in the situation. Almost. I kind of bought into that narrative. And through much reading and then through much examination of primary source material and so on, I came to a different opinion. And then finally I went there to see for myself, and it was enlightening and very disturbing.
Of course, yeah.
Brían, it's often stated that in general conversation that Israel was established after World War II to be a homeland for the Jews. Would you agree with this assessment?
That is, in order to talk about 1948 and what happened in 1948, we have to go back to the late 19th century and look at the formation at nationalist movements within Europe at the time. So as these empires, after the 1848 revolutions, there was an awful lot of friction within the Austro-Hungary Empire, in Prussia and so on, and you had various groups and ethnicities becoming more aware of their own national identity. Serbs, Croats, the Hungarians. And in that mix you had the birth of these nationalist movements, and one of these nationalist movements that would have been kind of spawned at the same time was this idea of Theodor Herzl's Zionism, which was a national homeland for Jewish people. And it began there, and it grew, and it wasn't necessarily religious as much as it was a kind of political ideology. So little to do with Judaism and more to do with a lot of the Zionists. The Zionist was a kind of a broad spectrum of political thought. So you could be a Zionist and be a communist. You could be a Zionist and be quite fascistic. You could be a Zionist and be just a middle of the road Republican. You could believe in democracy and still be a Zionist. But it all hung on this idea of having an area that was for Jewish people. And at the time, with the spawning of nationalist ideas, there was pogroms against Jewish people in Eastern Europe, in Russia, and so on. So many Jewish people left to go to America to find safety in America.
Yeah.
And this movement grew and grew and grew, and then finally the First World War came about, and that changed utterly the political landscape of Europe, but also of the Middle East, because the Ottoman Empire, which had ruled the area of Palestine, was crumbling, and the British took it over. The French took Syria and Lebanon, and then what they call the Great Betrayal happened when Balfour signed an agreement with this large Jewish agency, with the Zionists, that they would give them a homeland in the Middle East. Now, to go back again to the 19th century, there was already a Palestinian Jewish community. There was a Palestinian Christian community. There was a Palestinian Muslim community, and they were all subjects of the Ottoman Empire.
Right. Yeah.
And they all lived together in relative peace. And probably one of the larger Jewish communities was in Jerusalem. And at the turn of the century, there was a famous poet or famous musician from Jerusalem who remembered quite nostalgically how when it was Christmas, Muslim neighbours would celebrate Christmas. When it was Eid, they would celebrate Eid, and Hanukkah, they would celebrate Hanukkah, and that all happened together. And now, of course, these Jewish people were Middle Eastern people. They spoke Arabic. They ate the same food. They said that they ate culturally they were a unique bunch of people. But then the Zionist idea was that we'll start immigrating here with this Balfour Agreement, and now I'm quickening this up a bit. We'll start immigrating here. We'll start buying land off absentee landlords and people who were landlords from Damascus or other parts of the former Ottoman Empire, and so on. And very quickly, a large amount of people have come over in the 1920s.
And is there anything wrong with having Israel as a Jewish state?
I don't think there's a problem with having a state to call your own. Well, the problem is taking an indigenous population and removing them from the equation, and then suggesting that they never existed, when the evidence is there that they've existed there for thousands of years. The people who live there are descended from the people who lived there 2,000 years ago. People from Eastern Europe don't really have that connection with the land and the soil that's there, but they invented it, and they came up with a narrative that they have a connection, that they were removed from there thousands of years ago, when this is probably not the case. They were the Jewish people who are from Europe were proselytized. Their ancestors were met by missionaries who could have gone either way. They could have ended up being Christians, or they could have ended up being Jewish people. But then the proselytization stopped, so you had these large communities of Judaism in Eastern Europe, and across the Middle East, in North Africa, in Iran, throughout the Persian Empire, where they performed a lot of very important duties within the state, and they occupied very important administrative roles and so on. So you can't exactly say that they are, when they say they're creating a Jewish state, they're basically saying, well, we're going to have to remove the people who already live there, which is what they did. So going back to the 1920s, you have kind of an interesting thing happening. Like, you have a Palestinian Communist Party, and there's members who are Jews from Eastern Europe who've come over. There are people, there's a Palestinian football team, there's lots of these things happening, but the rate of immigration into Palestine is increasing, and very soon, under the British administration, you start to have this large amount of people, and there's no real talk of integration or anything like that. They're living kind of remotely and on their own, and the Palestinians realise, again I'm quickening it up here, Palestinians realise in 1936 what's happening. Very soon they're going to be in a situation where they are going to lose everything. So they rebel against the British British administration.
Mm-hmm.
This goes on for around 2 years. The Zionists who have come over have busily started planning already in the 1930s what they're going to do, and they're waiting for the right moment. So they join along with the British in destroying this rebellion. An awful lot of the Palestinian leadership, the very good leaders, the politically astute leaders, are executed, wiped out, are exiled. Second World War happens, and this is a massive deal breaker because it changes the whole thing. So suddenly, after the Second World War ends, you have an enormous amount of people from the concentration camps and different who have suffered unimaginably are sought by these Zionists and brought in to Palestine. And you have, it's all going to come to a head. So they're sold this idea that you're coming to this land without a people, for a people without a land. And this is one of their propaganda terms, you know. But there was the majority of the population in Palestine, even in 1948, is still Palestinian. It's Muslim Palestinians, it's Christian Palestinians, and it's Jewish Palestinians like the Samaritans. But they're not white Jews. There's a difference.
So, Brían, you've been to Palestine, is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Can I ask you how, why, and when did you go?
I've been wanting to go for years. I suppose I started to become very interested in it. I think I would be a person who I want peace. I want people to live in harmony and be happy. And I've always wanted to go to places where there had been strife and maybe lend a hand to people. People who I saw commonality with or saw a similarity in their history. This country was an intensely colonized country, and we still live with the scars of that today. So I was very interested from that point of view, and then I think the bombings in Gaza just before the Israeli election, I think it was 2008, it was the first one, cast-led. I found it deeply disturbing, the amount of loss of life, and I started to read more about it, and then I started getting involved, helping people, helping different people who were going over there, who were involved in projects like digging wells, and people who were kind of, going to the West Bank, helping out with the olive picking season, being witnesses at checkpoints to see that there's no abuses, being witnesses trying to stop settlers from taking olives, burning the olive trees, destroying the farmers' way of life. So I talked an awful lot to them, and I got their opinions, and then I took a career break from work. I didn't have any skills, I thought, to go over there, but I did know boxing and I do know martial arts. So I was talking to a Palestinian Christian friend of mine who was trying to set up a gym, and I didn't know him, I just emailed him. And he said, well, listen, I've got 3 lads who want to go do boxing. Can you set them up with boxing training in Ireland? And I said, grand, yeah. When are they coming? Oh, 2 weeks. Can you get it done? And I got it done. And we brought over 3 lads, our coach and 2 boxers, and they came here and they stayed with me and my family in Waterford for about 3 weeks. And then the following February I went out myself, and I went through Jordan, and I was welcomed there as soon as the Palestinian people. So first of all, Palestinians don't control any of their own border points, and to understand the West Bank, you have to kind of go back. West Bank and the Oslo Agreement is broken up into 3 zones: Zone A, Zone B, and Zone C.
Yes. So
Zone A is complete Palestinian control. Zone B is joint control, and Zone C is complete Israeli military administrative control. But the reality is they have complete control. But what they've managed to do is they've managed to get the Palestinians to police themselves through the Palestinian Authority security forces in the areas where they had the most difficulty, where they have the largest urban population. So Hebron, Nablus, Ramallah are kind of like 3 mini Gazas. And then into the countryside we have a large Palestinian population, you have Zone B and Zone C. But Zone B may as well just be Zone C. So Zone A basically constitutes about 17%. I'm not exactly sure of that, of all the land in the West Bank. And you have to remember the West Bank is probably only the size of County Cork. And it's not a very large area.
And given the fact that you've been to this area and the fact that you have said yourself that you used to train people who are Palestinian, boxing and MMA and other martial arts sports, how would you describe their standard of living, their living conditions, and their ability to compete in these sports based on their nutrition if they're living in a war zone?
Well, see, again, you have to go make a distinguish between Gaza and the West Bank. There's plenty of food in the West Bank, and this is an interesting thing. Again, it goes back to the Zionist narrative that it was a desert and they made it bloom. The fact is, up until 1967, the Palestinians were feeding the Israelis. They were exporting from the West Bank their fruit, their produce was going over there to be sold. So in Gaza, there is a massive wall, as you know, and there's only 2 entry points. You have Rafah crossing in Egypt, which is closed. The football team from Gaza that was meant to come to Ireland has been stopped.
The child's team, yeah.
Which is really sad. And then you have the Israeli crossing point. I can't remember the name. So the Israelis basically have worked out how many calories those people can have per day in terms of the amount of food and oil and stuff like that. So they won't allow concrete to go in because they say it'll be built it's used for tunnels. They won't allow medicines. They won't allow certain foodstuffs. They've basically worked out a whole system of controlling this population. It's a massive experiment in urban control.
And would you go as far as saying it's an apartheid state then?
The West Bank is deeply apartheid. Even Israelis like to say, well, we have 1.5 million Arab citizens, but they experience the same, level of. They experience that they know themselves that they are not equal to. Israeli society is deeply classist, and this is coming from an Israeli person who told me this, who is of Persian descent, and she says that there is certain people in Israel are more equal than other people in Israel.
So the standard of living isn't good.
Well, on the West Bank, sorry, getting back to the question, I'm going off in tangents here.
Okay.
But going back to the West Bank, standard of living, things are very dire there at the moment. The communities there are being strangled. Agriculture will be one of their main industries. After the Oslo Agreement, there was meant to be these industrial zones set up. They don't provide what is necessary for the Palestinian people. If they had control of the complete borders, it's a tourist gold mine. It's rich in history, it's rich in culture, the food is amazing. The people are very friendly, very warm. And then intersecting all of their communities are these settlements that are on, and they're building more. They announced yesterday, and these settlements basically are strategically placed along the Jordan Valley, and it's to change the numbers on the ground. It's trying to change facts. So, if there is a negotiation, if you have 500,000 Israeli citizens living in the Palestinian state, how can it be a Palestinian state? So there are a number of roads that Palestinians aren't allowed to travel on. So say if I was going to take a trip from Hebron to Ramallah, which is like Yall to Middleton, that will take me an hour and a half,
well,
2 hours.
James has a question for you on the transition and travel, so we'll get to that. But the last little bit I want to just push you on just to see what it's like, because I am interested about those young men and women that you trained who are Palestinian in Ireland and any that you trained in Palestine itself. How able were they for the sport?
They're very able, and they're tough. They're tough. They're very tough. Tough maybe without the technique, but it's all to do with, we live in a country where we have sporting facilities and they are provided. In Palestine, a wealthy person can go to a gym because it's expensive. So there's kind of a lot of very good weights gyms and stuff like that, but there wasn't and also then in terms of sport, basketball and soccer would be the 2 main ones. So women's basketball and men's soccer would be the 2 main sports. There's plenty of food, but things have become very difficult on the West Bank in terms of living standards, because we'll take Ramallah for an example. Ramallah is what they call the 5-star occupation. So the PA elite live in Ramallah. It's a great place to go and have a drink, have fun, and so on, but you're removed from what's happening in Nabi Saleh, where Ayatin Mimimi's family are from, and the villages where the walls are going through, or where they're building settlements, or you have settlers living on a hill overlooking your farmland. Or you have the Israeli army running roughshod all over the West Bank, or if you're one of the border communities where the wall has intersected your village.
I'll let James lead off with
that's
that
kind
question.
But just a point.
It's a fair
that
question.
kind of reminds me like North Korea. You know the way Pyongyang is kind of for the government employees and for the tourists coming in. It's not providing a real image
that's what
of the real North Korea.
Yeah, we had a guy on who went to North Korea.
Yeah,
Very interesting.
And he was saying stuff very similar to that.
Very similar.
Well, I suppose it's not by design, it's just the way it happened. You see, there are some very wealthy Palestinians that can afford to keep, but if you can afford a large house and they can have a decent lifestyle. And if you're in the PA, you sometimes have access to freedoms that the rest of the majority of Palestinians in the West Bank don't have. So they live in Zone B and Zone C, they live under this Israeli military administration, where they can be picked up and imprisoned without trial for a long time. And numerous times what the Israelis will do, if they see somebody who is uncompromising or good leader, they just nip him off to prison. So
it kind of sounds like that. Have you read much of George Orwell?
It's very Orwellian.
Yeah, 1984.
I would describe it social fracking. It's the most disturbing thing. Like, I'm sitting on the rooftop having a drink with my Palestinian Christian friend in his village, and drones are flying overhead. These drones are watching people all the time. Then there's the Shin Bet are at work. The Shin Bet and the Mossad are two arms of the Israeli secret police. Shin Bet are internal and Mossad are external. So Shin Bet have spies and they compromise people all throughout the West Bank. So you could be talking to somebody who you think is a Palestinian, who will say, for an example, if their grandmother is sick, so a Shin Bet operative would approach them and say, well, we'll get our hospital in Tel Aviv, but we want information on so-and-so, 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 so-and-so in this village.
Control,
yeah. And this works. Also, you've heard of the term pink washing. Yeah, pink washing. So if a person's a gay person or an LGBT person in a community is not out, they will approach that person and say, well, we know your story and we're going to offer you can come and party in Tel Aviv and we'll give you some money, but we want information on this person, this person, this person. Or if you don't, well, we're going to tell the most conservative people in your community about your lifestyle, and they won't approve of that and you won't be safe. So there's an awful lot of turning the Palestinian population against each other. And the genius of it is that in Zone A, they've got the Palestinians policing themselves. So the PA do their job for them in Zone A. So it's a really insane type of idea. There's a very good science fiction thing about called Colony, where Los Angeles is surrounded by this big massive wall and broken into districts, and these invaders basically hire people within they eliminate people who would stand up to them, people who are rebellious, revolutionary, they put them away, and then they take the more people who are motivated by money and they make them in charge, and they get them to police their own people. So it's a great way of dividing and conquering.
We're moving on towards talking about the issue itself of what's going on the ground today. But James has one final question for you on your own personal experience on the ground before we move into that. And you've hinted to it over the Orwellian stuff.
Gavin Collum and myself have heard about, borders and walls separating Palestine and Israel. But I just want to know yourself, Brían, how difficult for you was it travelling in and out of Palestine and in Palestine itself?
It wasn't too bad, I'll be honest with you. Getting out, you get grilled on questions. You're expecting it.
Bit like today.
You can't say where you're going.
Was that just because you were
Irish
call it
male.
tourists, or
Irish male.
would it be any different for Palestinian people?
Oh,
Yeah.
way worse.
Yeah.
If you're brown, it's way worse.
Okay.
If you're a Muslim, it's way worse. If you have an Arabic sounding name, you're going to get taken out and you get the rubber glove treatment.
Okay.
Or they're going to try and compromise you in some way. It's very similar to what MI5 would have done in the north. People trying to get people to turn on their own community. That's where they'll get them. They'll get them at those checkpoints. They'll pull them aside and they'll ask them questions, and then they'll try and compromise them. A friend of mine, she's American citizenship. She's a lawyer, but she's Palestinian family from Jerusalem. And every time she goes through Tel Aviv Ben Gurion Airport, she's subject to the most revolting stuff.
Okay.
I'm not going to go into detail about it. It's horrible.
And would that be because of her name or because she's a US citizen?
Her name. She has a Palestinian sounding name. The last time they provided her with her Facebook page, they asked her about people. They wanted information.
Wow.
She's an American citizen, but they didn't care. Some American citizens are going to be treated differently to other American citizens, even an evangelical Christian.
Yeah.
Come on in, even though they are the most anti-Semitic group of people in the world, So yeah, it's I didn't experience that. Other people have,
But you know what it's like.
but I know it's not like coming into Dublin Airport or going into Paris or something like that and saying just going through and showing your passport and walking through. And even in America, you get asked a few questions: where are you going working, lads? Stuff like that, and it's done in a kind of a jovial. Sometimes they're trying to trick you into saying, "Oh, I'm not working here," or "I'm working in Boston and I'm going home." You know, that kind of way. There's this kind of warmth to the security, but when you get there, there's a certain like, where are you going? Who do you know? What do you want? Like I said, it wasn't.
So
It was nothing compared to what a Palestinian would have to go to, or a person with an Arabic sounding name would go to.
So let's get into the questions about what it's like on the ground.
Yeah.
And this ties into the experience that your friend
Yeah.
had. So would you say, Brían, that this conflict is centered on religion or race?
It's race.
You'd say race?
I think religion is always, I feel, is an excuse. When you're taking someone's land, your person on that land doesn't dislike you because of your religion. They dislike you because you're taking their land. It's a very simplistic way of looking at it, but it's true. If we took our town of here in Waterford and a community moved in that established settlements around our town where they were allowed to move with wherever they wanted, and we were kind of told, well, you can't go on this road today because we've closed it. We wouldn't react very well to it. We wouldn't hate those people because of their religion. We'd hate them because they're disrupting our lives. They're just disrupting our harvesting of our crops. They're disrupting our day-to-day life. And that's essentially what happens on the West Bank. They intentionally make it difficult for people to survive and live and enjoy life. There's no joy in life when you can be raided and then knock on the door. You're worried about that knock on the door where all the male members of your family are going to be taken off to administrative detention, and you're not going to hear from them, and you're not going to have any recourse.
Well,
legally.
what's the correct term for this situation? Is it a war? Is it a conflict? A struggle? What is it?
I think it's like, I think if it was a war, you always assume there's equal combatants, equal power to damage each other. Not the case. Is it what was the other word you used?
A conflict or a struggle?
Conflict, again, it's not conflict. It's colonization, and it's the struggle against that colonization. I think the Israelis could have peace. They could have everything that they want if there was no settlements on the West Bank, if they allowed Gaza to get back to normal, if they allowed East Jerusalem to be the capital of a future Palestinian state. But they've changed the facts on the ground. They've pumped huge amount of money into bringing Americans and Eastern Europeans and Western Europeans of Jewish ancestry into smack bang in the middle of the West Bank and giving them these subsidies to live in these communities where they're coming into direct conflict with the people who already live there.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no denying that. That's a fact on the ground. That's indisputable.
Mm-hmm.
They have not ceased the growth of their colonies. It was the same with the colonization of Ulster. When they realised Ulster was such a problematic province of Ireland under the O'Neills, they realised that what's the best way to defeat the O'Neills and the people there. Well,
Mm-hmm.
we'll move in poor people, and we'll give them land at better standard of living than they've ever had before.
Mm-hmm.
Those people won't want to move,
Mm-hmm.
and you've got that situation now in the West Bank. So it's a very difficult life, particularly in the hot spots around Hebron, around Bethlehem, around the Jordan Valley, around the camps that I mentioned to you beforehand, around
Mm-hmm.
Ramallah, Nablus. Their military bases are basically all high ground is either occupied by a settlement
Or military.
or a military outpost.
Mm.
So, and then the whole map is intersected by permanent checkpoints and movable checkpoints.
Mm-hmm.
So all your life is basically under control of the Israeli administrative system, which has been in place since they occupied the area in 1967.
Mm-hmm.
Just going back to what you said about Israel and peace, Fatah have said that a truce with Israel would not come without a price. What would you make of that statement?
I suppose what's the you see, I think that under the UN Charter you're allowed to resist being occupied. It's not a crime to resist people coming in and taking over your country. The means by which you do that are going to be fermented by your experience of that occupation.
Mm.
So if you believe you can peacefully remove your invader, you'll use peace. If you think the only way you're going to do it is fighting, you're going to fight. And far be it from me to kind of say, oh well, you should do this, you should do that. It's not for me to say that. It's something that certain groups have to come to terms with. I will say that Fatah have gone along with Fatah would make up the majority of the PLO,
Mm-hmm.
and they would make up the majority of PA.
Mm-hmm.
And they've become heavily invested in, the PA is heavily invested in the continuance of the occupation. That there are certain families that now control foodstuffs, frozen meats, petrol, tobacco, goods in the West Bank. So there's a whole economy there that exists that some people are making a mint out of.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas ordinary Fatah people on the ground are experiencing the occupation day to day. They don't get a pass. They can't go out of the country.
Mm.
If they move, they're likely to be arrested. If they turn up at a protest, they're going to disappear.
Sounds like some of these Palestinian governments and officials who have power, whether it's in the West Bank or Gaza, sound like they're pretty happy with this situation because they still have a level of control.
They have a level of control. There's also a high level of corruption. Not with Mahmoud Abbas, but some people around him, definitely.
Mm.
He's there was when that conflict in 2014 started,
Mm-hmm.
the whole thing that happened with the young Palestinian with American citizenship getting his arms broken, the young man being burnt alive in the forest by right-wing Israelis, that brought about a situation where his position was untenable. He was about to leave. So what the PA do an awful lot of time is when there's an outrageous act by the Israelis, they'll allow a certain amount of a rage, and then they'll pull it back in.
Mm-hmm.
So they use it. So they'll say the right things. They'll say things like, we want, there's going to be, they'll talk tough, but they'll continue on with this.
Mm-hmm.
Now, again, going back to the situation on the ground as regards people, what Palestinians think themselves, they went along with Oslo. They thought it was a good idea. there was jobs for the first time, administrative jobs. So you've got people, the PA water, PA like Irish water, PA education system. So these people are all getting paid by the European Union and the United States and the United Nations. So these people then, what's the next thing that happens then? Banks come in. And then the people start getting loans. Oh, I'm going to have a nice car. I'm going to have a nice TV. So now, like, you're less likely to rebel against things when you have a certain level of comfort and you want to hold on desperately to that. Because one PA employee is responsible maybe for a large extended family, and his payroll comes into that village. So now people, look, let's not upset things too much. But meanwhile, there's a new wall coming in here. There's another settlement going there. And people are becoming desperate. And one of the things you would never have seen in Arabic culture or in Palestinian culture would have been people begging. The last visit I made, there was people on the street begging.
Wow.
Because the money is drying up for the PA. Things are becoming unsustainable. It's a powder keg. So the PA, Mahmoud, what comes after him, I can't tell you. I haven't talked to anyone lately of what the situation is in regards to that, but things are changing. People are becoming more desperate. There's a whole kind of desperation setting into even activists trying to look after their families and take care of themselves.
Senior leaders and officials in Fatah have reportedly kind of started to align themselves with various armed groups in the West Bank in preparation for a possible departure of the President Mahmoud Abbas and a possible violent struggle over his position that might occur as a result. So in the case that Abbas departs, what do you think is the outcome?
What I'd like to be the outcome and what I think will be the outcome are two different
scenarios. Go
I
ahead.
would like to see a similar tack taken to what Irish Sinn Féin did in the 6 counties. You had Bobby Sands in prison. What do you do to publicise Bobby Sands? You elect him to Parliament.
Yeah.
It was a very good public relations thing. There's a General Barghouti, who was Fatah, was arrested many years ago and is kept in solitary confinement, and he's not allowed out. Why is he not allowed out? Because he's one of the members of Fatah who speaks out against the Oslo Accords. He speaks out against the collusion between the PA and the Israelis. So say, for example, my friend who's living in Zone A, the Israelis want him, they'll make a phone call. They'll talk to their counterpart in the PA. The PA will close off the entry point. They'll come into the camp. They'll keep all the people away so there won't be a riot. They'll arrest my friend and then they'll take him off. And then they'll open up things again. So that's that kind of collusion is going on. So there's an enormous amount of friction within Fatah, within all the organisations. PFLP, which is the socialist group formed by Palestinian Christian George Havashi, that group were absolutely against all cooperation and collusion with the Israelis on all terms. They think Oslo was a joke. They didn't want anything to do with it. They've been proved to be right because things haven't got better for the Palestinians. In fact, they've got much worse. So what will happen? Well, I'd like to see them elect in absentia one of the prisoners as president and bring that to the forefront, that there are thousands of prisoners who haven't received any kind of trial and are still in administrative detention. But what could happen is you have, again, we have to go back a little bit again, to 2006 when you had free Palestinian elections. I think it was 2006.
Yeah.
And Hamas won the elections.
That's right.
And there was a huge clampdown on Hamas in the West Bank. So they were wiped out in the West Bank. Their leaders were arrested and they were either imprisoned in Israeli prisons. One of the biggest Israeli prisons is actually in the West Bank. It's Over prison. Or they were imprisoned in a PA prison. So much for democracy. So you have democracy's gone. So it's democracy only as long as we like it. So the West didn't like that Hamas won. So they immediately tried to spur on a coup in Gaza, where Hamas had held on, and that's their traditional hinterland.
Okay.
So they sponsored a coup there that failed. So you had a bloody civil war situation there for about 48, 72 hours between those two groups, who were mainly Fatah versus Hamas. So similar type thing you would imagine would happen in the West Bank, but I don't think it would, because the only armed faction on the West Bank, and that's the genius of the Oslo Accords, is that you have a Palestinian security force, but they're all controlled by the PA. So all the guns are all in one place.
Yeah.
So there's no proliferation of weapons to smaller groups like the PFLP or Islamic Jihad or Hamas, who've essentially been wiped out on the West Bank. There's certain places, Hebron, Jenin, where you would still have a large kind of, you would have a certain amount of weapons and a certain amount of in control of different groups.
So do you anticipate a coup when he leaves? Is that what you're predicting?
They'll have a kind of I think what you'll have is whoever you won't. The only person who's going to be allowed in to be the next president of the PA is going to be someone who meets with the approval of the Americans, the Saudi Arabians, and the Israelis. They won't allow somebody who is a good leader, or they're going to ask someone who has principles or is uncompromising, or who just wants to see beyond words something really substantial that the Palestinian people can actually get on with their lives. So that's all they want to do. A lot of them want to just exhale and breathe, and they can't do that. So a lot of Palestinians, I think, could be convinced of a one-state solution
We'll get to
if they were offered
yeah.
a citizenship and equal rights. Of course, I think they'd take that. A lot of them would. Not all of them, I think, but that's never going to happen, because as soon as that happens, well, you've got the Israeli population, which is 5.5 million Jewish, 1.5 million Arab, Palestinian, Christian and Muslim, and then you'd have 3.5-4 million Palestinians joining that population as Israeli citizens.
Well, this, there are a lot of different aspects to this debate, right?
Yeah.
And James asked you at the beginning about how someone growing up in Tramore could get interested and involved in a conflict so far away. I want to press you a little bit on that in relation to what's happening on the ground today. So in Palestine, it is itself separated into two pockets of land, the West Bank and Gaza, led by the PA in one zone, and in Gaza it's led by Hamas. For me anyway, right, I want to see peace on the ground, but I understand that there are good people on both sides and bad people on both sides, to simplify it down. And I have issues with Hamas. The Hamas Charter famously stated that the peace and freedom of Palestine could only be achieved through jihad, that there would be no solution for the Palestinian question except through jihad. So, is support for Palestine a support for terror? And secondly, if we had an independent Palestine, whether it's West Bank and Gaza together or two separate zones, or however this works out, do you think we'd have much in common with them in terms of ideas and freedoms?
Hamas, it's an interesting thing we bring up Hamas, because Hamas are, again, I think, a response to the failure of the pan-Arab movements in socialism and pan-Arab nationalism. And they're actually an invention of Mossad and the Shin Bet, because they wanted to drag people, Palestinians, away from secular Palestinian ideas and make it simplify things for a Western audience. Like, so what do you find scary? You find a woman who has to wear hijab or a beach in Tel Aviv. Let's have this narrative. Let's create this narrative. Palestinians are a very diverse bunch of people. Some very liberal, some quite conservative. Ramallah is often remarked as being the feminist capital of the Middle East. I do not tell a Palestinian woman how to behave or what to wear. They'll put you in your box. But if they like you, they'll cook you some very delicious food. You'll put a stone on over there, I'll tell you that. They're the most strong and willed women going. Some can be quite religious, and some are not religious at all. Some are quite secular, some are atheistic, so on. So it's a broad spectrum of people. But the Israelis wanted to create this idea that it's all Muslims and they're all bad and it's all scary. And we get back to our Orientalism, what Orientalism means. It's about dehumanizing and making these people seem exotic and different and totally different to us. So creating this idea that Hamas are completely different to us.
But Hamas wrote their charter, and they did use the word jihad. I mean, that's
jihad is a word
people.
that, I mean, it's a word that has various kind of connotations and meanings. It's a struggle. It's a struggle as much as it's war. So their experience in Gaza during the Intifadas was that fighting works. They got the Israelis to remove their settlements. They felt, well, let's keep fighting. But then something happened. They ended up they win the election. And then they're being attacked from within. So they continue to remove their enemies, just as they've been removed from the West Bank. So, not to make this too complicated, but the Israelis brought about Hamas. They allowed it to rival the Fatah, to take away membership, to simplify things, to make it more scary. Palestinian freedom, the idea of Palestinian freedom more scary by trying to make it, or giving into Islamophobia and so on. Now, I don't agree with Hamas either. Politically, I don't have much in common with them. But they have a right to struggle for what they see as their freedom.
But that's what I'm getting at, is that, you know, we may want free Palestine because we're anti-war, or because we believe that the treatment of these people by Israel is intolerable. But if we have a free Palestine, which is also saying, oh, you know, gay people should be stoned, I mean, should we be supporting that kind of an idea?
Absolutely not. I think that's again, this is a broad spectrum, that the resistance in Palestine is very broad and very diverse. It's Hamas are a result of occupation. This is what happens when you have an occupation.
You would say an independent Palestine wouldn't be led by Hamas?
No.
You don't believe that?
I don't think so. I think if you remove the settlements tomorrow, if there was a land bridge where Palestinians could traverse through, if they got what they are entitled to under the 1967 borders, which Hamas has recently stated that they are quite happy to accept. They've got to the stage now, we're not going to get this, so let's go for 1967 borders again. Let's have that. If that, which is what the international community has advised and recommended, then they would, I would say, they would disappear.
Okay.
Gaza has the potential to be a very nice place. It has, again, wonderful food. It's a little bit different from the West Bank. It has it's a great bit of beachfront. The people are very warm. They're very decent people. So again, we've been kind of, the Western narrative can skew things and make things seem different to what they are. So the West, on one hand, says Hamas are bad, they're very Islamic, and then on the other hand, they provide Saudi Arabia with all the means they need to continue on as a state, and the most dire form of Islamic of Islamic faith, Wahhabism.
Wow,
yeah, and actually Hamas aren't Wahhabists at all. Well, they're quite conservative. They're quite strict, but they're not the Saudis.
I'll hand to Gavin and then on to James. But my last pressing on this, while they are looking at their question, forming it, would be on that point of Islamic terrorism, or whatever word you want to use, to get at its basis for listeners at home. Would you equate support of Palestine with support of terrorism or jihad?
No, not at all. No.
You'd reject that entirely?
I reject that entirely. If anything, I think, you know, it's, if we support human rights and the struggle for freedom, then it should be unconditional. You know, and I think Irish people, on the most part, are very at peace with themselves in realising that the Palestinian cause is a very just one, and that the Israeli point of view, or the point of view that they're trying to create, the narrative that they're trying to create, is a false one, and it's based on racist ideas, and it's based on sectarian ideas, and it's based on on ideas of superiority, you know. So I would have to reject that.
Okay. Gavin?
You and Colin were talking about Hamas, and I just want to ask, do you think Hamas is desperate to strike a deal with Israel?
They've been wanting to strike a deal since day one. They're made to be the most unreasonable sounding people. You know, like when a politician in Ireland plays the green card, Charlie Haughey was famous for, we're going to get back to 6 counties. And that would have been seen as inflammatory by the loyalists and inflammatory in Westminster. But he was playing to his base. Hamas say things for their base. But they want peace. They want the place to be opened up. They want things to return to normal. They don't want the place to be getting bombed. And within Hamas, there are differing voices as well about how best to achieve that. So after they won the election and they fought off this coup that was backed by the Americans and backed by the Israelis and PA, they settled into this kind of nowhere land with the Israelis. Things kind of continued on. Things that were meant to be delivered in the Oslo Accords were kind of stopped. The Israelis started to tighten the stranglehold around the West Bank. They made a big deal of removing their settlements, how good they were removing their settlements. It's ridiculous. Like if they put a settlement here in Waterford and they took it out, would we be saying, "Oh, well done, thanks"? No, we wouldn't. We'd be kind of saying, "Yeah, now give us back the rest of it." The people in Gaza are not from Gaza. There's very few of them are actually from Gaza. They're from that coastline all the way to Tel Aviv.
That were pushed back.
Villages upon villages that were wiped out, exterminated, wiped from history. These villages are paved over with playgrounds, or they built forests on them, or they put cattle ranches on them, just to wipe out the idea that they ever existed. Now this is going back to 1948 again. So the people of Gaza came under Egyptian jurisdiction after 1948, which I can go back to again in a second, but get back to the original question about what happened with Hamas and what they want. So they settled into this very kind of nowhere land with the Israelis. The Israelis kind of put the stranglehold on it, and then you ended up settling into a kind of a cold war between them. And then 2008 happened, and the Israelis and the Western media kind of put out this idea that Hamas started it. They're firing rockets over the wall. Our people in our communities, in our villages, can't live in safety. So let's go back to that. That's not exactly how it happened. The Israelis started bombing. A rocket got shown over. And this kind of tit for tat thing happened. And then you had Castled, I think it was Castled, 2008, where they started jumping, firing, dropping white phosphorus, dropping very heavy munitions. And this was before an Israeli election. So the president, I think it was Prime Minister Olmert, was looking for a win. And he's needed it because they'd had a loss in 2006 with Hezbollah in the north. And their manhood had been affected. The machismo of the ultimate, this, you can't defeat the Israeli army, that had been affected. So there's Gaza. Let's bomb the bejesus out of it. And they did. And they used different munitions. And they were testing out stuff. They were using different types of munitions that they want to sell to the rest of the world.
Wow.
Different types of weapons, And lo and behold, we get a couple more incidents like that. And every time they go to bomb, there's kind of almost a political or a kind of an idea that we're going to use something new this time. Let's look at this bomb. It just take out that terror block. And then of course they brought in all the tanks there for the last one, and you saw the destruction that they caused. And then they went in on the ground. You see, what Hamas wanted the last few times was they wanted the Israelis to engage on the ground and not bomb them from the air. They wanted them to come in. And they did, and very quickly they lost a lot of men. So they withdrew, and they looked for this peace thing. So you get this, the Egyptians are negotiating this peace treaty with them all the time, so they fire over a few rockets, Israelis bomb them, and you get this kind of thing going on. Meanwhile, the people in Gaza are not having a very nice time. It's horrific.
How do you respond to this question? Actually, this was put to me by Daniel O'Dowd of the Israel-Ireland Alliance. And it ties in very well with what you're saying about that ground approach. How would you respond to him when he said to me, and he asked me to put it to you, that Hamas use Palestinian people as human shields?
That's let's look at the geographical size of Gaza. It's in a densely populated area. Let's look at the number of people that they've murdered on the West Bank. They've been used as human shields. The people I know have been shot dead, walking about their daily lives. There's no one using them. It's a kind of a ridiculous type of thing for him to say. It's one group of people have this huge arsenal, and they're using it at will, destroying large tracts of buildings. The cultural centre just last week in Gaza was wiped out. I suppose that was a barracks or something like that, was it? I'd like him to explain that. Are those children on the beach, those boys playing football, targeted by the drone, were they human shields? I don't think they were. I think it's literally disgusting. I'd like him to justify how they killed those 4 boys. Their bodies were strewn over that beach. There was nowhere near any part of the conflict. How dare he? How dare he do that? How dare he equate with that? Has he even been there? Has he seen what I saw? I saw people being beaten to a pulp for no other reason than that they're Palestinian. It really upsets me, and it really makes me wonder about his empathy. Where is his empathy? He's following a propagandist line. Blame everything on Hamas. We can use as an excuse for all our crimes that, Hamas are the reason why we've had to kill those boys on the beach. Or the people that I know who have been shot dead. They weren't members of Hamas. Some of them were apolitical. They were just young kids that wanted to play football for Real Madrid or be the next Conor McGregor or something like that, and they've had their lives taken away from them by a ruthless occupation that toys with these people, that delights in, takes pleasure in the extrajudicial killing of people, that has these great celebrations of the dead, the people barbecuing as they watch Gaza being bombed to a pulp, cheering it on. You're identifying with those people. I really have to wonder about your morals or your morality. So I think he's bought into a certain amount of Hasbara, and he's unable to break away from that, and that's fair enough. If he's seen what I've seen, he'd have a totally different opinion. Again, it goes back to the history. If you agree with the Israeli narrative, you're coming up with this idea that we had no land and we came to this land that the British gave to us, and we made it this beautiful place. It was a desert, and there was no one here, but yes, there was people there, and you took it off them. And in Deir Yassin, you murdered and raped the entire population of the village, and now you've turned that village into a mental hospital. And you refuse to come to terms with what you've done. It's pure evil. They used horrific tactics to drive out the Palestinians from where they lived. And they created a narrative that they were attacked all at the same time, which was completely untrue. It's debunked by Ilan Papp's very good book, who, and I have to say this now, Benny Norris, who's the most right-wing Israeli historian, said that book is a fabrication. He said it doesn't. It's none of it's true. And then he was asked, well, please clarify what exactly is untrue. Well, he said that the Israelis, that the Haganah had came up with a chemical weapon that could make people blind. And it was only ever used on dogs. And that was his main critique of Ilan Papp's very scholarly work. So when you go back to that and you start revisiting the narrative that's been created, that these unreasonable Arabs were just trying to wipe out these poor people, it's a complete lie and fabrication.
Well, James has a question on the birthright narrative.
Yeah, I recently saw a video of young Jewish people on this birthright trip to Israel, and they were on a bus, and a young Jewish gentleman was challenging the tour guide over the omittance of Palestine from the map that they received. And the tour guide just claimed that this was simply the way Israel and its people saw it. So I just want to ask you, Brían, you've been to Israel, I want to ask you about Israeli people's attitude towards Palestine, and would it be as hardline as the Israeli government?
There is some very brave people living within who have Israeli citizenship, who are part of various groups that work on behalf of, Palestinian prisoners and Palestinian child prisoners. You've seen the videos and pictures of 5-year-olds and 6-year-olds and 7 and 8-year-olds being arrested by 4 or 5 Israeli soldiers and brought down to, again, they must be in Hamas or something, are they? A terrible threat. Do you know what I mean? They're kids and they're being dragged off. Sometimes for throwing a stone or something like that, that kind of thing. As regards the birthright, they're young American Jews, and you have to look at the relationship between American Jewish community, which has been a community that has always fought for justice, particularly in the South, deep South in America during the KKK times. The American Jewish community allied itself with Martin Luther King and the civil rights groups. There were great voices out against injustice. So you had that community that in 1967 kind of bought in to this idea of Israel because of what happened. So look at this, the Israelis, look, they have to defeat in all these countries in that war. And then they became a very, they started to identify with Israel, and with the American Jews started to identify with Israel, and some of them started to leave and go and live in this, what they believed was this kind of utopian society. And some of them stayed and became very much part of Israeli society. Some of them got there and saw, oh my God, this isn't what I signed up for. I thought we were coming to this place that didn't have an indigenous population, but there they are in their villages and they're treated terribly. But in recent years you've had, and this kind of went unquestioned within the American Jewish community up until very recently, and now you actually have critical thinking coming from American university campuses, and it's actually a lot of American Jewish people, a lot of British Jewish people who are kind of left wing, who are at the forefront of BDS and the forefront of, asking for civil rights for people, for the same type of, for Palestinians. So a Palestinian citizen on the West Bank under Israeli administrative detention or the jurisdiction has very little rights. So these people have, through the internet and through people speaking out, have become more aware of what Israel is and of the type of society that Israel is building, which is very right wing, which is very race based. It's very it's class based, because so Ethiopian Jews aren't Ethiopian Jews aren't the same as a good person of European Jewish ancestry or American Jewish ancestry. They're just different, so those people face discrimination within the Israeli Jewish society. See, I don't want to conflate Judaism, which I don't think has anything in common with Zionism.
This ties into my next question very well. So you've mentioned how Hamas plays at their base. You've just mentioned how members of the left-wing community in the UK are starting to examine Israel's treatment of Palestinians and those of Arabic descent. And also now you've just brought up that issue of Zionism. So this all ties in very well with the question. So Labour Party leader Jeremy Corbyn has been heavily criticised for his support of Palestine and criticism of Israel and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Do you think there's a fine line between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, and where is that line?
Anti-Semitism exists. It's something that's ingrained into Western society.
Mm-hmm.
It's a Western phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
That it was in Western countries that the crimes against the Jewish people happened, and the discrimination that they faced in those Western countries. It wasn't something that existed in the Middle East, essentially. There were, obviously, over the years, there's been different things, different changes and so on in leadership and so on in different countries. But like I said, the Persian Jewish community had its place. The Syrian and Iraqi Jewish communities had their places.
Mm-hmm.
And then along came the Zionists and this idea of Zionism in a Jewish homeland and removing an indigenous population. So, getting back to Jeremy Corbyn has always been very pro-Palestinian. He's also very pro-peace, and he's been willing to talk to people about that. So we talked to Hamas. We talked to, people say, oh, you can't talk to Hamas. Same people say you can't talk to Provisional IRA. And if that was the case, we would still be, there would still be bombs going off in the north of Ireland. Mm-hmm. So you have to be prepared to talk to people in order to bring it about. Is it anti-Semitic to criticise Israel? Absolutely not.
Mm-hmm.
But you have to be careful about how you talk about and how you describe things and the way you do it. So to come up, is there a global conspiracy?
Mm-hmm.
Do Jewish people have more of a say on world affairs? Going back to these kind of crazy tin hat people who have these kind of who say anti-Semitic things, who are anti-Semitic. There's anti-Semitism, but being pro-Palestine and wanting a just solution is not anti-Semitic.
So you don't hate Jewish people?
Absolutely not.
Do you hate the state of Israel?
I would say that I have nothing but contempt for it, because I've seen it in action.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen what it's done. I've seen what it's done to friends of mine's lives. It's squashed the hope, the warmth, the human decency out of them. Left them shells of themselves, changed them utterly through their oppression. I have nothing but contempt for that.
Mm-hmm. And how would you've said this narrative, and I hear it a lot, and I find it quite interesting, about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Do you think that the media is mainly Jewish run and controlled, or the banks are mainly Jewish run or controlled, or do you think that that's an anti-Semitic narrative?
That to say that is, not only is it kind of like an anti-Semitic thing to say, it is a falsehood it's gigantic falsehood. We have a media that's controlled by corporations. That it's an entertainment business. You're independent journalists. You're going about your own way. You're not influenced by your advertisers. You're not influenced by your government. Your government's not telling you, well, you have to do this, you have to fall in line, which is what an awful lot of Western media does. So we have this idea of fake news, coming from Russia and stuff like this, and you can get into an entirely different discussion about it. But the fact is that all our news is sanitized, and the language is almost weaponized to create a certain idea of a situation. So even the way most Western media covers the situation in Palestine and Israel is falling into a narrative that suits Western culture, which again goes back to very racist ideas, because Western culture is superior than Eastern culture, and Eastern culture is barbaric.
That's what they put forward.
That's what they put forward. They put forward this idea that, you know, they're barbarians. They're animals. Look at. Did you see that movie? Those hijackers. They're all the same type of people. It's playing into that, and the news goes along with it. You know. So you know we have these kind of Orientalist narratives that is kind of the foundation stones of any kind of news reporting on the Middle East. And now that we have a proliferation of kind of a lot of independent media, you actually get a better idea of what's happening now than you would have 10 years ago or 20 years ago through the internet. The media itself just kind of plays to that. They try to make it that it's this kind of equal conflict where there's two sides that are equally responsible. Can't be equally responsible if you are, one side has this huge amount of military hardware and the other side has a sling or some crappy rocket. That's there's no parity of arms in this struggle. There's one side has a huge military apparatus, and the other side is completely under, doesn't have the same level of ability to hurt the enemy. Its enemy. Sorry, carry on.
No, you're fine. Explain to us a bit about how the USA's close relationship with Israel is kind of detrimental to Palestine and their struggle for freedom and international recognition.
It's kind of it goes back to, it's an interesting thing. That's a very interesting thing. Again, it's very historical, and you have to kind of look at it in terms of the history of the Middle East. This is go back to the 19th century and talk about the Great Game. So the Great Game was what a Scottish spy called Britain's interest in Afghanistan. So they went into Afghanistan in order to stop the Russians going into Afghanistan. So it's chess.
Yeah.
So the Americans decided, not at first they weren't too enamored with what they saw was kind of very left-wing kind of Zionist movement that was creating Israel. And the Israelis were actually courted by Stalinist Russia, and they actually provided them with some large amount of assistance. It was after 1967 that the Americans said, well, do you know what? Israelis can be quite good for us. We can have a good relationship with these guys, and they'll be our little base in the Middle East. We'll support them, and they'll kind of keep an eye on things for us in terms of the global war, Cold War with the Soviets. So, and this happens in 1967. The Americans kind of say, well, you know, these guys can do a job for us, and we don't have to put any men in the field and so on. They'll do a job for us, so let's back them up. Even though they've attacked us. In the case of the USS Liberty, where they bombed the USS Liberty, which was a egregious act of war, but the Americans covered it up. And they covered up the testimonies of all the sailors on it. It was an intelligence gathering ship for the US Navy, and the Israelis bombed it for several hours, killing over 33 of the crew. And they bombed it apparently because they picked up radio traffic that the Israeli army that had launched a surprise attack on Egypt was massacring prisoners because they were taking too many prisoners. They didn't have anywhere to put them. So apparently this was one of the reasons why they attacked it. They attacked the ship. So strangely enough, the Americans said, well, you know what, but still, let's go with these guys. They're our guys now. So you have this kind of this relationship begins. And then you have the growth of lobby groups in the States. And these lobby groups have an awful lot of power in terms of congressional elections and presidential elections and so on. So AIPAC and these other groups go about trying to make sure that any congressional person who's going to be elected is going to toe the line as regards Israel and supporting Israel and so on. So there's a very kind of symbiotic relationship. And then we have the Christian evangelical community who believe that the Zionists are going to bring about Armageddon and Jesus will come back, and then they'll see that they've made a mistake and that they'll all convert and they'll become good
Christians
again. So there's a very strange relationship between America and Israel. And the Israelis court it, and the Israelis are in close communication with those lobby groups, and they're in close communication with other groups who are looking to, for example, in the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn is somebody who they can't allow to be part of the Prime Minister of Britain because it's bad for them.
And on the other side of that, having read a Time magazine article from 2014, it listed that Turkey and Qatar are supporters of Hamas through public support and financing. So is it fair to say that it's both sides of the international community are causing this conflict in the Middle East?
The economic power in the world resides essentially with the United States and the European Union. Those two groups have the power to stop this immediately. They could stop it in the morning by withdrawing their funds, or, for example, if sanctions. So it's okay to sanction Iran. Okay. It's okay to sanction Syria. Okay. But it's not okay to sanction Israel. If the European Union decided that they wanted to sanction Israel, they could stop this in the morning. The settlements would stop. Israelis would realise that this is not good for us, but they won't do that. At the moment, they won't do that. And every time they go and murder a load of people, like they did at those protests, the European governments will kind of like, that's bad and so on. They'll complain, they'll make a couple of statements as regarding that, but they won't do any essential about it. As regards the Turks and the Qataris, again, they play to their base. They're talking to their population. It's it's playing the great game to such, but their input into the whole thing is far less and way smaller than anything that America can provide, or so on. And very strangely, the Israelis and the Saudis are becoming closely linked with each other because they have the same fear of Iran, and they're getting into again the great game. We go back to this whole game of geopolitical chess. So another thing that some of the Zionist lobby will say, what's your concern with Palestine, but you're not concerned about Syria? I'm very concerned about Syria. I've gone to camps to help people from Syria. My economy in Ireland is not, or my government doesn't have any connection with Syria at all. We can't influence Syria whatsoever because they've been isolated, and rightly so.
So,
but just to finish that off, we are integrated with the Israeli economy. We have this ability, not just in Ireland but in Europe, to kind of be agents of change there, change their way of doing business, that they would actually offer the Palestinians something decent.
Well, I'll ask you directly about boycott, divestment, sanctions momentarily, but recently when I was out in the US, I met cousins of mine, and to my surprise, they were very supportive of Donald Trump, and I was very delicate in how I approached that, and I asked just why, and they said, well, he makes promises and he keeps them, and that's something that they seem to like about him compared to other politicians. So US President Donald Trump lived up to a campaign promise of moving the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which he promised his voters, and he fulfilled. And he said part of the reason that he did this was to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital. Do you support this decision? Why and why not?
Well, obviously, I wouldn't support it. And it was a very...
Why not?
It was he went against every American administration since the formation of Israel, since they came into being, for obvious reasons. But he did it because he talked with the Saudis, and the Saudis have kind of washed their hands of the Palestinians, essentially. They think they can buy the Palestinians' loyalty, and they think they can buy Palestinians into accepting a peace deal. They also don't like Hamas, because Hamas are part of the Muslim Brotherhood, who they despise. So this interesting thing going on there. Donald Trump, it was an easy thing for him to do, but he couldn't have done it, I don't think, until he'd had that meeting with the Saudis, and then it kind of said, I'll do it, and sure, what the hell.
And what's wrong with Jerusalem being the capital of Israel? What's wrong with that?
Well, Jerusalem was, up until the 1967 war, was a city that was 100% Palestinian. There was a kind of a West Jerusalem and a kind of a border there from the 1948. But the old city and the outlying districts, of which there's some 200,000 people, was all Palestinian. So it was naturally their capital. It was naturally a very important place for them, not just for the Muslim population, but for the Christian population on the West Bank, which there was quite substantial numbers. So you have, by doing that, you're aggravating them. The situation in Jerusalem is very desperate. It's a very divided city, obviously, but by doing this, he's exasperated it all. The level of poverty on one side in relation to the other side is terrible. The way they're policed differently, the way certain things are allowed to happen. So the whole of East Jerusalem has been flooded with narcotics, because that's also a good way of social fracking. Turn people on each other, allow drug dealers to sell with impunity, but don't you dare sell drugs to our side of the city. That type of thing that goes on, and also just the whole atmosphere. That's where, when I saw one of the incidences that I'll never forget, I was very ashamed of myself. I thought I should have done something about it, but I felt that I promised my family that I wouldn't get involved in anything. I didn't go to protests. I tried to stay out of that. I had a job to do, so I was quite content to do that. So when I kind of came face to face with this brutality, and it was quite shocking, because I've seen people being beaten up, in town and stuff like that. I've been in fights myself. I've had people try to beat me up. That kind of situation. But what I saw was just the total lack of empathy. The total lack of the feeling that these people were beating someone who it was their right to do so because they were better, they were superior, and I found it utterly disturbing. I watched 8 people, it was police, border guards, and army, and they tasered this boy. I wouldn't say he was older than 14 or 15. Tasered him 3 times. He kept fighting. He kept pushing and kicking back, and they just kept kneeing him and punching him and kicking him, and batons, and the taser went in 3 times, and then they dragged him off down another way. I followed for a bit, and I remember there was a woman stood next to me, a Palestinian woman, and she was shouting and screaming, and I looked at the 2 kids who were watching this, and they looked at me, and they were terrified, absolutely terrified. And I remember going back, I remember walking around in a daze then around Jerusalem, because I'd been in Ramallah, and Ramallah is the 5-star occupation, and I was out drinking every night with the lads from the gym, and I was with all these people, and it was grand, you know what I mean, and I was having a great time. I hadn't seen anything. I could have left that and had a totally different opinion of things. And then just then all of a sudden, within the space of 24 hours, there was 5 people dead. One man was a father of 5 from Hebron. He was a 30-year-old man, if I remember. He was arrested and he died of a heart attack in custody. And they wouldn't release the body because they'd beaten him to death.
Wow.
Yeah. And he was basically told as he was leaving that was it. For some strange reason, they kind of basically said, you better say goodbye to him because you're not going to see them again. And they beat him to death. And that sparked off another wave of shootings and so on. This hadn't been propagated by any kind of Palestinian knife attack or bombing. This was just daily life. So I remember this weekend, it was this weekend and it was a Saturday, and I was just walking around like in a daze after seeing that, half ashamed that I didn't do it. Because I've always said, like, if I saw someone get a bit of a kick in it, do the right thing. I thought it was better, I thought it was a little bit better. And then, so I'm walking down the street. I went back to my hotel. It's a Christian hotel. I talked to the lady, and she started crying. I said, why are you crying? And she goes, I'm sorry that you had to see that, but you have to understand, this is every day. She's bawling. She was bawling not because it was the beating, she was bawling because it was like, I'm sorry you had to see that. There's a certain amount of care within Palestinians looking after people. They just take it's part of their culture. That is hospitality. They look after you, take care of you. They'll do anything for you. They give you a shirt off your back. When you go to a house, they'll lie out a load of food on the table, and they'll just sit there watching you, and just really kind of thanks for coming. Or the lads I looked after, I remember visiting their village, and I went up and I got in. It was 4 plates of shawarma, and then rice dishes and your vegetables, and there was a whole roast chicken. And I sat down and I had about 5 shawarma. I was starving. It was lovely. It's just so good. All the food there, amazing. And I stuffed myself with shawarma. And then the lads all sat down and said, please eat. But if I eat a plate full of shawarma, he says, no, the chicken is for you. We have the chicken for you. This was really thank you for looking after our lad. Now eat the chicken. So I have to eat this whole chicken after eating a whole plate of shawarma, and I'm just kind of bit by bit. This went on for about an hour, and the lads were just kind of looking at me. It's good. There was a little lack of language there, because when you kind of go from Ramallah, there's not much English. And just that love and care that they show people that come to their country as visitors was remarkable. And then to see the other desperate nature of what they have to live under, and there's almost this kind of fatalism in their humour. They'll kind of, when they're talking about the torture that they receive from Shin Bet and stuff, they'll talk about, they'll laugh. They'll talk about, they tied me up by my hands, or they put me in this cage, and it was bloody winter outside, and winter on the West Bank is quite high,
mountains,
and it's freezing at some stages. The weather changes. It's strange. So they'll be telling you all these stories, and it's kind of laughing it off. I'll give you one better than that. It's kind of talking when if you go up to West Belfast and you talk to the hooded men,
same kind
people
of thing.
kind of laughing about, this fella said he was going to throw me out of a helicopter. I said, how do you know I was in a helicopter? And shit like this. This is crazy stuff that we would kind of find horrifying. They have this kind of sense of humour, because how else can you live unless you kind of see some joy in life?
And these are real Palestinian people.
These are people, it's not on the telly. It's not like the way that West tries to portray Middle Eastern people as these fanatical monsters that you should be scared of. They're out to get you. They're not. These people are culturally and emotionally very intelligent and decent people that have had this problem from Europe landed on them. The way Europeans treated Jewish people brought about this situation. The far right nationalism, the far right fascism gave birth to movements that go against democracy and go against human decency. And this brought that to Palestine and landed it on top of them.
Well, a very important thing for people and for a nation itself is its flag and its symbolism. And often at soccer matches, even in Ireland, you'd see the Palestinian flag being waved in GAA matches. And Gavin, I think you have a question about the flag itself.
There's a new bill proposed by Israeli politician Annette Berko, which will prohibit the use of the Palestinian flag at public demonstrations, and breaking this law will carry a one year jail sentence. Berko also went on to say that flying the flags of enemies should not be tolerated in the public sphere. Do you think this is another step by Israel to eradicate the identity of Palestine?
Yeah, this goes back to the whole narrative that they're trying to create, that these people didn't exist, that they're just, they have no connection with the land, not like the Israelis do. The Israelis were thrown out of that land by the Romans, apparently. This is the history that they want you to believe. When we know that history doesn't go like that. The people that lived at the time of the Maccabean revolution against the Roman Empire, those people that lived at that time would have been Jewish people. But people who lived in Ireland 2,000 years ago were pagans. And a lot of people today now are pagans again after things, but we became a Christian country. So when the Romans became Christian, that area became Christian overwhelmingly. When the dynasties of the Muslim dynasties rose up out of the desert, and they conquered what the Byzantine Empire owned, those areas became Muslim. But you always had you still had Christians, you still had Jews, you still had. Point being is that the people there, they're the descendants of the people who've been there for thousands of years. Just like the people in this country are the descendants of the people who arrived here after the first ice age. If you're from France or Texas or Kiev, you don't have a connection with this place. Religiously you do. If you're a very stalwart Christian, you have a connection with Jerusalem, you have a connection with Bethlehem for those reasons. But you don't need to go over there and say, well, I'm going to make this my country now. It's just insane. But that's kind of what you're asked to believe. So this whole notion that they have no identity. So you'll hear an awful lot of Hasbars say, no, they don't. No, they're just Arabs. They're different from other Arab people. Just like there's nothing culturally the same, other than they speak the same language, between Emiratis and the Saudis. Syrians are people in the Levant. Culturally different people altogether. As different as French and Polish, or Irish and English. We might speak the same language, but culturally and our worldview is different. So the Levant, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, it's all very diverse and all very different. Just like that, the Palestinians were different to people who lived in Jordan and people who lived in Egypt and so on. So they try to create this idea that there's just no such thing as a Palestinian identity. That they invented falafel and they've invented kanafa, and they'll even come up with this idea now. Look at this traditional dress. So there's a wonderful shop, if you ever get the chance to go to, in Hebron. If you're ever there's a wonderful workshop run by the women's commune there, where they make all dresses and scarves, traditional clothes. I went in and I remember buying a load of stuff, just fabulous clothes, handmade, and they've expropriated all this stuff. They said, this is part of our culture, traditional dress. It's not a traditional dress.
It reminds me of when the Irish sports players, Rory McIlroy or Conor McGregor, they always call them English or UK.
It's a McDonough
brother. Why I know the two you're talking about, the brothers. So you would say that there's nearly that kind of attitude in Palestine, Israel, that Israelis are trying to wash the culture and claim it as theirs?
Yes, absolutely. They want to make it out, create the narrative that we've been here for thousands of years, we're only taking back what rightfully belongs to us. You're from Germany, you're from Poland, terrible things were done to you there, and those countries should answer for what they did to you. But the Palestinians didn't do it to you. Palestinian people are still the same people that have existed for thousands of years in the same place.
Do you think that they need to go home to Germany or Poland?
A lot of people who became disenchanted with Zionism took up their grandparents' passports, and there's this huge, I think, Israeli community in Berlin that left. A lot of arty people, a lot of people with kind of Marxist, anarchist kind of connections, and they said, no, this is not for us, we're leaving. And how do you come to, where do you go? What do you have?
For many of these kids, the only place they've known is Israel.
Absolutely. So what do you do? I mean, what you have to look at what would be just, what would be right. It would be a new country with a new name, with a new flag, with a new kind of idea that all people are created equal, no matter their religion, no matter the colour of their skin, and so on. And then you'd have a democracy.
A one-state solution.
Could do that, but it would have to change a lot of facets. And the Israeli society is such a militarized, such a hugely pumped up, nationalist, kind of fascistic society that it would be almost impossible to undo that.
But would you prefer to see a secular one-state solution which isn't called Israel or Palestine, which doesn't have that Palestinian flag which Gavin mentioned, or the Star of David, which is the Jewish flag, the Israeli flag? Would you prefer to see a secular solution?
I would want what my friends on both sides of the border want. Now, you'll have to ask them. So if they ever come over, I'll bring them down for an interview.
Do.
But that's what I want. I want my friend who was in prison be able to complete his studies and go back to being an MMA fighter. I want my friend whose cousin was shot in the head, a 13-year-old kid who was shot in the head from distance. I want him to be able to forget about that and raise his kids without the threat of that happening. You know what I mean?
But it seems wrong to think that that there has to be a Palestinian state and an Israeli state where only brown people live in one area and those who are, Jewish or of European descent live in one area. It sounds very racist that way.
Well, it's already racist. It's already, but it's
on both sides.
Jewish people lived in Palestine during the Ottoman Empire for hundreds of years, right back to the, since there were Jewish people. They lived there. They were Palestinians. They were Palestinian Jews. The Samaritans are Palestinian Jews. They're the most Jewish people on earth. They are the direct descendants of a sect of Judaism that goes back to the time of Jesus Christ in the Roman Empire. That group, they're mentioned in the Bible. Their villages are mentioned in the Bible. They're a very tiny community that are quite, insular. But they're Palestinian. It's just, again, Judaism is a very diverse, broad spectrum of opinion. So you have differing voices within that community itself. There's a lot of this. They were beating up their own people there last week because they refused to serve in the military because it goes against their religion and so on. But you're in a very. You've got like Benjamin Netanyahu, and you've got these people that would, if they could get away with it in the morning, they would just wipe out Gaza. Well, actually, what they'd like to do is they'd like Egypt to take over Gaza, but they would, if they could get away with it, they would drive every single Palestinian across the Jordan River, if they could get away with it. But they have to appear to be a liberal democracy. Look at your gay pride parade in Tel Aviv, isn't it wonderful? Look how open-minded we are. Look how brilliant we are. But yet we're going to go and try and out gay people in a more conservative part of the country and use them against their own people. That kind of thing. There's the kind of contradiction.
One final question from me anyway would be, do you think that Palestine is worse off now than it was before Donald Trump became president? I mean, it's been tough living in Palestine for a long time.
Yeah.
But do you think it's worse now since Donald Trump has come into power?
It's getting worse every day.
Okay.
It goes.
And is that a direct
it's
result
kind of like up and
Donald
down?
Trump?
Is it? Do you know what? It's not really, because it didn't matter. Obama was there. They were still building the settlements, and they were still continuing on at a pace.
Yeah.
you've got to, like, I mean, look at Israeli society, and Israeli society is very brainwashed.
Yeah.
They believe if they leave, they're going to get killed.
Yeah.
They bring young Jewish people to Auschwitz.
But isn't that quite fair given their experience? I mean, they were a race that were nearly wiped out.
That using the Holocaust, using that to justify what you're doing to the Palestinians goes against a lot of humanist principles that a lot of young American Jews believe in. The social justice I'm talking about of young American Jews and Jewish people. I mean, I'm talking about some of the greatest intellectual minds of our century are Jewish and anti-Zionist, are against the idea of Zionism, you know. So, you know, it's such a broad thing, lads. I mean, you could talk about so many different, I mean, I've barely kind of got into what happened in 48, like, and stuff like that. You could talk about that for hours.
We might have the chance tomorrow with the speaker.
Yeah, you
on
know,
the
it's kind of
Pro's
like, I mean, you can ask him about it. Like, I don't expect, you're going to get, I would expect the same Hasbarist type of narrative that they've come over, that they've come back to take to the homeland, and that Hamas and the Islamists and it's us, we're guarding the gate, and if we're not there, these guys are coming to Europe to get you, when that's not a true narrative at all. The Palestinian people are very decent, warm people with a deep culture and a deep attachment to that area, and they deserve better than what they're getting.
I'll ask you my last question, and
Right.
then Gavin has a question about views. But my last question is this. You've mentioned how Ireland has a relationship with Israel regarding trade.
Yeah.
And, you know, recently Israel won the Eurovision in 2018, something which, you know, maybe not many Irish people care about anymore as Eurovision, but we are the country who have won it most. A growing movement in response to the conflict in Palestine and in Israel is BDS, which is boycott, divestment and sanctions, looking to boycott Israel, divest from Israel and place sanctions on Israel for their behaviour in Palestine. And there have been calls nationally for Ireland to boycott Eurovision 2019, which will be in Israel. I'm not sure whether it'll be in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv, but it will certainly be in Israel, depending on what you classify Jerusalem to be. So what do you make of the BDS movement and such calls for Ireland not to take part in Eurovision? And what kind of relationship do you expect, as an Irish person, what relationship do you expect our government should have with Israel?
I think, you know, first of all, I would support boycott. It's a very peaceful way of getting a political point across. You're not dropping bombs on people, you're not shooting people, you're just telling them that your behaviour at the moment goes against the principles by which we wish to live by, and we don't feel we can engage with you until you change your behaviour. I think that's what's wrong with that. It's not anti-Semitic. We've boycotted before. We should boycott. It's our duty to boycott. South Africa, there wasn't an official boycott as such. There was a kind of a cultural boycott, like the Irish rugby team didn't play South Africa. And it had an effect, a deep and profound effect on South African culture, because the rugby team was very important to their identity. But what was going on in the country, in Soweto and these different places, this institutionalised murder and imprisonment of activists and of people who were against the apartheid system. And you'll see people argue, oh, but look how South Africa is now. It was better off under apartheid. Come on, don't dare you go there. That's just plain wrong. They're going to have to come to terms with how they're living and their own. But at least now they have a democratic means by which to change that, and hopefully things will get better there. But to kind of say something different is, you know, ridiculous. So going back to boycott, I think boycott is a peaceful way of getting a point across. We don't have people say, oh, why aren't you boycotting Syria? We do boycott Syria. We do boycott Russia. We do boycott Iran. We sent a Russian diplomat home on some spurious charge that they'd poisoned somebody in England, which is, we still don't know the full story.
And how about boycotting Eurovision 2019?
Oh yeah,
definitely.
It's terrible anyway, so let's not even go there.
But do you think it would be better to send a protest song, which has been done before in the Eurovision? Do you think it would be better to send a song with some form of protest?
I think if a lot of countries kind of disengage, it would be a good sign to them. That it's just not I think it's a personal choice that people have to make as regards performing there. So when bands like decide I'm going there, because I think there's two sides to every story, and there's not.
Lana Del Rey was in that controversy
She's
the other
kind of
day.
saying something similar. I don't agree with the government, but I'm going to go there. But you're legitimising that government. When you play that crowd in Tel Aviv, you're going to be performing for people who next week are going to be out patrolling streets on the West Bank and involved in thuggery or in murder. So come on, think about it. Really think deeply about it. See, it's unusual. Some people who, until you've experienced occupation, and I think there's people like, especially, hence there's such a kind of a support for Palestine in Belfast and Armagh and Tyrone. Until you've experienced that knock on the door at night, which we never had. Thank God we never had to go through that. You're going to be like, your opinion is going to be shaped by what you see. So a lot of people, like a lot of these musicians like Lana Del Rey, she thinks that she's going to this very normal situation because through Orientalism and through the media, through movies, you're kind of given, they're the underdog. They're not the underdog. It's not the case at all. The underdog is the person who queues up at Calandia checkpoint and is basically put through what, if you've ever seen abattoirs where the cattle are pushed through, there's people squeezed in for hours in the middle of the summer heat and pushed through these things where these 17-year-old child soldiers who don't know any different are kind of there with their guns and kind of like, and you can see in their eyes, they hate these people. They hate these Palestinians because they've been bred to hate them. These people just want to go on with their daily life. They want to go to pray. They want to go to the hospital. They want to go to somewhere in East Jerusalem or something like that.
And what should the relationship be with our government and a government which has child soldiers like that? What do you think?
Well, I mean, if we're going to kind of send home a Russian diplomat on something spurious, well, send one of their diplomats home. Send home the people connected with the Israeli security apparatus.
In Dublin.
Yeah, why not? There was a case, I believe that like that gentleman in London who worked for the Israeli embassy, who was actively trying to, in the Al Jazeera documentary, was actively trying to target British politicians. I mean, if somebody's doing that, if a foreign government is working in that manner, send them home. Send some of them one for one. The actions of Ireland, we're a small country, we have limited power. If the European Union adopted an official line of boycott after the next massacre, then the pressure would be felt. Israelis would feel tremendous because they're very integrated into the European Union economy. There's an awful lot of Israeli companies working in the European Union. If pressure was brought to bear, we could have a peace, a just peace, because have some sort of peace negotiation that's where everyone's on an equal footing. I don't think Netanyahu wants peace. I think in order to control your population, they need perpetual conflict. In order to justify military expenditure, in order to justify conscription, in order to justify your security apparatus, which is also an industry. Think about the amount of people the Israelis employ in border security, police security, prison security. Think about the type of people who are attracted to those jobs, where they're going to be looking at vulnerable people. The threat and the use of of torture and so on.
Mhm.
You know, you're creating a very sick society, but it's an industry. The arms industry, the security industry, and they're exporting it to all over the world. They're exporting it to the Americans. So American police chiefs are being brought to Israel and being shown how to control an urban population. Who do you think that's going to be used on in the future as populations get quite large? You know, it's not conspiratorial, I don't think, to think that it's African American communities. You know, which is what you saw. You see these huge, massive armoured jeeps and heavily militarised American police forces marching into neighbourhoods, and you're asked the question, who's teaching them these kind of techniques? And then you find out that these guys have been on courses in Israel, and it's one of their main imports. Security, drones, you know, your digital footprint. You know, finding out information about you, using it against you. This is an industry, and they're part of that. So the main way to hurt them is to disengage with that kind of activity, not to take part in it, not to be involved in it, to make their companies feel, you know what, it's going to hurt you financially. So those companies will turn and say to their politicians, well, you know, listen, let's give the Palestinians a state. Let's get rid of our settlements. Let's let them have a West Bank state, or give them dual citizenship. Allow them to have the ability to move freely around the world. Not have this document there. They're basically kept in a massive prison. Gaza is a prison. So is the West Bank. If you're a Palestinian, it's very difficult to leave and to come and to go. It's a huge experiment in how to control human beings and to control a society. It's very, as you said earlier on, Orwellian in how they have this perfect system for controlling a large population when you're in the minority. In the minority, they are the minority, the settlers are the minority on the West Bank. The Palestinians are the majority. But yet they can complete control over their daily lives.
And just to go on from there, my final remarks would be, and not just only for me, for anyone who's listening who would be of the same kind of, not mindset or opinion, but just kind of stuck in the middle. Is there anything you could say to sway, you know, those people over to the pro-Palestine side?
I think it's not just it's been pro-human being. You have to look at justice. You have to look at what constitutes justice, what constitutes human decency. Could you look at the Israeli state and think that they exercise those two last points? They'll usually retort back that we are just doing this in response to Hamas. But there's no Hezbollah and there's no Hamas without Israel. There are things that came about through Israeli aggression. They came about from the invasion of South Lebanon. Hezbollah didn't exist before 1982. They came about from that. They're a response to colonialism. And they can use them as the bad guys and label them. But there is, and Irish people have a sense of this ingrained in their soul and their DNA of justice. And what you have now is not justice. And read beyond what's on the internet. Find books. Get back to books. Find scholarly works. Find people who've been there. Talk to them. Ask them questions. If you meet a Syrian refugee who's finding this is their fourth time being a refugee because their father was a Palestinian and now they were driven out of Palestine into Yarmouk, and then they're driven out of Yarmouk into Lebanon, and then they're driven out of Lebanon into Greece or Europe. Find them, ask them their story. You know, when you talk to people who are from Israel, you know, find out what they know about it. A lot of them are going on the education that's presented to them. They're not aware of the crimes of the initial state and how it came about. They don't know about Deir Yassin. They don't know about the murders in Gaza. I think it was 55. They don't know that, you know, during the Suez crisis, Israel invaded Egypt. You know, they don't have any ideas about these type of things because they've been presented this type of narrative.
Yeah.
And it's very true about, isn't it, in 1984, it says, he who controls the past controls the present, who controls the present controls the future. It's the exact same thing. If you can create a narrative that Palestine never existed, then you can justify just about anything. There are people there who I've met. They exist. They're there. They're real. They're decent people. They want a decent life, and they wholeheartedly support the boycott. Because I know this gentleman tomorrow will say there are Palestinians in the West Bank who are being persecuted because of this boycott. That's not true. That's a fabrication. You know, he'll say that, you know, Israel only responds to Hamas. It's not true. They have virtual total control, and there's no Hamas in the West Bank, and they shoot people for fun. And those people don't get any jail time. These are all facts. These are undisputable. You know, and they have came out and declared that it is a racial state. It's a Jewish state, and no matter what happens, you can't change it. Ireland was the Free State of Ireland was a very Catholic country. I doubt you could say that now. It's still partly Catholic. It's still, you know, people like their communions and they like their confirmations and they're Christians and their weddings, but we don't take orders from those people anymore. You know, these guys are saying, no, this is what we are. It's constitutional now, and if you're not Jewish, good luck. You know. So
well, we give both sides a chance to speak, and we let our listeners make up their minds.
I agree with people. You should listen to it, but you know, be critical. And I'm talking to the listeners. I already know that you're critical thinking gentlemen, but you know, go through what I said. If there's anything that's not true about what I said about the formation, of the state of things as they are in Zone A, B, and C, if you know, there's something that you don't agree with about the formation of Zionism, you know, if you don't believe that it's, you know, racial, then talk to some Persian or Ethiopian Jewish people, talk to the young American Jews, talk to these people, listen to them. Always be critical, always be self-critical, always ask yourself, are you right? And don't always be certain. And I feel more certain about this than many other issues, but there are things I kind of go back and forth between. You debate with yourself. Don't always be absolutely 100% certain that you're right.
Well, you said that it's very important to talk to people who have been to Palestine and ask them questions, and we've had that privilege today by you coming on. And
you're very welcome.
Thank you for answering our questions so extensively, and being willing to give us your personal account, give us your account of what you've read, what you've considered, and to be so open to our listeners.
Not at all. Pleasure.
Thank you, Brían Ó'Fanín, for appearing on The New View.
Come on.